Darwin attended the University of Cambridge in 1828, where he was free to collect beetles and explore his naturalist hobbies. Here, he met the professor of botany, Professor John Stevens Henslow. Henslow mentored Darwin and granted him with the opportunity to be a naturalist on the voyage of the HMS Beagle. After the Beagle's voyage, Henslow ignored the piles of plants sent to him by Darwin. So Darwin reached out to William Hooker, the professor of botany at the University of Glasgow, who passed the plants on to his son, Joseph Dalton Hooker, in 1843. Shortly after they started corresponding, Darwin wrote Hooker in 1844 that, quote, "I am almost convinced, quite contrary to the opinion I started with, that species are not, it is like confessing a murder, immutable," end quote. Despite the blasphemy, Hooker decided to work with Darwin and help him gather evidence on the origin of species. Cambridge, Hooker, and the letter came together to form the basis of Darwin's interest in botany. Cambridge provided Darwin with an introduction to the subject, especially through Professor Henslow and the field trips he offered Darwin. Hooker's specialization in botany influenced Darwin to pursue this field himself, and Hooker, as director of Kew Gardens, supplied Darwin with seeds for experiments. The letter between Darwin and Hooker cemented their relationship, which eventually led to Hooker convincing Darwin to primarily study plants. Cambridge, Hooker, and the letter's influences on Darwin will form the first part of the exhibit, with the second half focused on Darwin's later work with plants. The content from Darwin's books, such as Insectivorous Plants, Fertilization of Orchids, and On the Movement and Habits of Climbing Plants, will be pulled from to discuss evolution, natural selection, and coevolution. Insectivorous Plants details the special adaptations in carnivorous plants that allow them to survive in difficult conditions. Darwin performed experiments on these plants and determined they are specially adapted to conserve energy by only activating when prey trigger their trap mechanisms. Fertilization of orchids is especially important because it directly or indirectly led to all modern work on coevolution. Darwin examined how insects and orchids developed complex ecological relationships and how these led to speciation within both. On the movement and habits of climbing plants, Darwin explored phototropism and how these adaptations presented advantages and supports his theory of natural selection. Cambridge, Hooker, and the Letter of Confession are all important stepping stones that led Darwin to later develop his interest in plants and the botanical world. Darwin never would have written any of his books on plants and fleshed out the idea of coevolution without these important guides in his early years.